Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind, kicking off 1954 with Vladimir Kerman taking the Ha-3 out for another flight, this time with the engines moved so that they're firing directly through the centre of mass of the aircraft. That in combination with our reaction control thrusters should mean that we are able to reach altitudes hitherto undreamt of and set new world firsts for the Soviet program. I mean, we are leaving the American program in the dust. They haven't broken 30 kilometers yet, and we are about to head just shy of 76 kilometers. Obviously, we're not really able to exceed that because the altitude ceiling of this cockpit is 75 kilometers. So Vladimir having to hold his breath a little bit here, but still managing to easily complete his altitude contract. And every time we complete this contract, the target altitude is going to increase by 5 kilometers. So we can only do this so many times this episode before it actually hits 75 kilometers, and then once that's completed, we don't really want to be going much higher without risking actually killing one of our test pilots. But we actually have pretty much perfected the art of gliding back to the Space Center at this point, and after Raphael pioneered it in the previous episode, after Nina had an unfortunate accident, we are now landing on the runway, which really, I mean, doesn't give us that much of an advantage. To be fair, like, there's no real advantage to doing this over landing with the emergency parachute, but it looks a lot cooler and it gives me some Realism Overhaul street cred. Anyway, in the meantime, we have just unlocked satellite era materials science, which gives us integral tanks, as well as balloon tanks, but we're not going to be unlocking those because they are way more expensive than we can possibly afford right now. But that means that we're actually able to get working on our first orbital rocket a little bit later in the episode. We also unlock satellite era science, mature supersonic flight, and hypersonic flight to begin researching, as well as grabbing ourselves an altitude sounding rocket contract for our third launch of the R6. So this one hopefully shouldn't have a third stage engine failure, so it has to carry 85 units of sounding payload up to 160 kilometers. So that's just mounted onto the second stage, and then the third stage is going to push it all the way up and get ourselves yet another altitude record. So this mission, yet again, it's not really pushing many boundaries, but the main focus of this mission is just getting some more flight data on this S2-253 engine, because this is a rather crucial engine for our orbital launch vehicle. So we want to get as much data as we can to try and reduce the chance of it failing, because we're really only going to have 2 shots at orbit before the end of the year. So we really want to try and make them count if we can. Otherwise, the advantage that we have over the Amerikanskis will close very, very rapidly. But this time, thankfully, the third stage actually ignites and burns for the full duration, carrying us all the way up to 2,000 kilometers of altitude, giving us yet another uncrewed altitude record. So this was really rather a profitable mission, which is something we needed, considering the second launch of this didn't actually earn us anything. Although, yet again, it did actually give us engine data, so the primary sort of function of the mission was still successful. Unfortunately, though, upon re-entry, the third stage explodes, which of course was expected, but it scattered debris as far as Moscow, with a supersonic fleck of paint actually whacking into Comrade Yosef Kerman's window, giving him such a fright that he had a stroke and died immediately. Yeah, Sergei Kerman losing the page of the report that describes quite how far and wide the debris from the mission was scattered, so being mainly left alone to continue working on Kaputnik whilst the power struggle in Moscow starts kicking off. Raphael here just completing the second type of contract that the Ha-3 is capable of, maintaining a supersonic speed for 3 minutes. Although, unfortunately, upon returning to the Space Center, he has a little bit too much velocity and he's forced to trigger his emergency parachute and land vertically, which doesn't really matter. The aircraft is still in one piece, but the recovery crews head out to find a rather sheepish-looking Raphael standing atop the Ha-3. So now we're going to send Alexander out on the other type of contract that this aircraft can complete, which is, of course, the altitude contract. Now, we can do these contracts every 90 days, so we're just sort of going to be alternating between this type of contract and the supersonic flight contract. I am wondering, with just how high and how fast we're sort of pushing these aircraft, when we get a better cockpit and possibly a slightly better upgrade to the XLR-11 engine, I wonder if we might be able to go over the Kármán line with one of our Ha-planes. I mean, it won't be able to be the Ha-3, of course, but perhaps the Ha-4. I'm wondering, if the first man in space might actually be on a suborbital hop from an aircraft, because of course the X-15 was capable of crossing the Kármán line, so why not the Ha-4? That's what I'm wondering. Of course, we're not going to be sending a space plane into orbit. The first orbital vehicle will almost certainly be a derivative of the Vostok spacecraft. That's quite a while away yet. We have to actually upgrade the R&D center before we can even begin researching the human-rated space capsules. So yeah, it might be an idea to try and do the first man in space with a hypersonic aircraft. Who knows, that'll be something for a few episodes yet. So, of course, Alexander returning to the runway. We've got this pretty much down to a T, although, of course, we do have some mishaps like, like the last time with Raphael having to land with the emergency parachute. Even so, no crashes as of yet, which is rather glorious. The Amerikanskis, I hear, aren't having quite so much luck, as I got a rather angry message from N9 loaded with a fair few expletives after he ended up killing Milton Kerman. So deepest condolences from our space agency to our rival space agency over in the US. But it clearly shows the superiority of our Soviet technology. Not only are we going higher and faster and flying more frequently, but we're not killing quite as many of our test pilots. This time sending Vladimir out on another one of those supersonic contracts, while we're just finishing up our final preparations for our orbital launch attempt. And once again, returning to the runway. What a beautiful sight. We really have got this nailed. It's a really satisfying thing to be able to land these aircraft each time on the runway and not actually have to, land them on emergency parachute in the middle of nowhere. So let's get on to our orbital launch attempt. Now, I actually started designing this R7 rocket quite a while ago, while I still only had access to separate structure fuel tanks, which are really, really heavy. I was hoping I might be able to just sort of gimp my way into orbit. Unfortunately, no, that didn't work, so I ended up having to go back and replace all of the fuel tanks with integral fuel tanks instead once we unlocked them. If we'd been able to do it with separate structure tanks, then we would have had this pretty much ready by the beginning of the year, but unfortunately no, we didn't quite have enough Delta V with the separate structure tanks, so unfortunately, yeah, we had to actually have access to satellite era materials before we could start launching satellites. I mean, what gives. I tried to make this look as distinctively Soviet as possible, but it was nowhere near the same size as the real-life R7, mainly because the real-life R7, I mean, it weighed about 260 tons or so, and it was massively overbuilt for launching a 50-kilogram satellite into orbit. I mean, it was an intercontinental ballistic missile meant to launch nuclear warheads. It was only because it was capable of also putting a satellite into orbit that it ended up doing so, but it wasn't designed for that purpose. Whereas here, we're designing a launch vehicle specifically to launch a small satellite into orbit. So that means that we have rather tight Delta V margins, but we can do it with a 60-ton rocket, which I think is really rather impressive. But because of that, we ended up having to simplify the design a little bit. We ended up going with 2 booster rockets rather than the R7's 4, and of course we're also using RD-103 engines as our main propulsion system in the first stage instead of RD-108 and RD-107s. I mean, this thing is, I believe, 2.3 meters in diameter, whereas the real-life R7 was 2.8 meters in diameter. So it's a fair bit smaller, but I think it still looks rather awesome. So here we are on the pad, 29th of July, 1954. And we are making our first orbital launch attempt. And you can also see, well, if you paid attention to the numbers in the Kerbal Engineer readout, why exactly I wanted to test the S2 engine as much as I did. That S2 engine has a rated burn time of 95 seconds, and we're going to be burning it for 3.5 minutes. So over double its rated burn time, which is really, really dangerous. Requires quite a bit of luck just to have the engine not explode. But you can see here, the first stage actually ends up launching absolutely flawlessly. We detach our booster rockets, not getting a Korolev across, unfortunately. We only needed 2 boosters to get the thrust to weight ratio we needed in that first stage. And of course, as I said, I mean, this thing weighs 59.99 tons. I cut our weight margins on our new launch pad really, really fine. We were only just able to launch this thing. If I could have strapped more boosters to it, then I would have, but perhaps that's something for future launch vehicles. Unfortunately, we don't even get to the rated burn time of the S2 engine. It burns for a few seconds and then we have a performance loss. And then only a few seconds later, we have a full permanent shutdown of the engine. Yeah, this thing had tight delta V margins to begin with, so without the engines burning for their full duration, there's no way we're going to get anywhere near to orbit. So we do fire our third stage. We can see there, it changed a little bit from the initial design. I ended up using the XLR11 engine because it's actually way more reliable and way better than the ORM65 engine. Of course, we've been firing it loads in our HAR program, so it is a very reliable engine which doesn't even require ullage, so it doesn't actually need to fire while under acceleration, which is extremely useful, as well as having multiple relights in case there was a failure. So it was a pretty good choice, but unfortunately it just did not have enough velocity to push us into orbit, and our first satellite attempt ends in failure. So we're going to immediately get building a second attempt, but in the meantime we have a few more flights of the HAR-3. This time we are launching Raphael on yet another altitude contract, going all the way up to 76 kilometers before gliding back to the Space Center. Now this is actually the last of these altitude contracts that we're going to be completing, because this one was actually to get up to 75 kilometers in altitude, and if we start going any higher, well, our pilots aren't actually going to survive the trip. So from now on, we're just going to be doing the supersonic test flight contracts every 90 days or so. So reducing the number of half flights that we're going to be doing, at least until we get some slightly more advanced cockpits so we can build the HAR-4 and perhaps even cross the Kármán line. This time Raphael actually manages to land on the runway, although he did actually manage it in the previous episode. He was in fact the first of our test pilots to land a HAR plane, so I'm sure his buddies didn't give him too much trouble for having to use his emergency chute. So we're going to launch yet another flight. This is Alexander doing, as I said, another supersonic contract, just holding a velocity above the speed of sound for 3 minutes. And these are really rather routine. They don't net us that many funds, but they get us even more engine data. I don't know, I'm trying to get as much data as I can on the XLR11 to reduce the chance of it failing on our satellite attempts. You know, any engine data is good engine data. These flights more than pay for themselves. They give our pilots a bit of experience and we get a little bit of funding. So the number of these contracts we're actually completing, even though each of them only gives us about sort of 6,000 funds advance and then another maybe 10,000 when we complete it, it certainly starts to add up over the course of a few years, and you can certainly tell from the advantage we have over the Amerikanskis in our actual KCT upgrade points. We have quite a few more invested into our Space Center than those Amerikanskis. You see there, Alexander slightly overshooting the runway there, but thankfully coming to a nice gentle stop. So while we've been doing our supersonic flights, we have unlocked early science, satellite era electronics, and satellite era science, which means we can actually strap some solar panels and scientific instruments onto our second satellite attempt. They really don't add that much mass, and although we don't have enough solar panels to actually keep the satellite alive, it will keep it going longer so that we can get a little bit more science. If we're launching a satellite and we now have access to a bunch of scientific instruments, well, we might as well strap them on board. We're not going to be able to complete the scientific satellite contract because its orbital parameters need to be pretty high. This R7 certainly does not have the delta V for it. It can barely put something into orbit as is, let alone put it into a high eccentric orbit. So that will have to be a challenge for the next episode. But thankfully this time the launch goes exactly as planned. I'm honestly not entirely sure how. We pushed this S2 engine so far over its rated burn time. The fact that it didn't explode was a minor miracle. It was after my first launch attempt, I realized that really this is a fundamentally flawed launch vehicle. And I don't really see us using it to put any more satellites into orbit. We've got another one being built right now, just in case this launch attempt also failed. I think we'll just repurpose that as a suborbital launch. Perhaps remove the third stage and stick a small biological, or perhaps an advanced biological capsule on there. Maybe send a dog up into space. I know the Amerikanskis have been doing that. Our spies, television coverage has been nicely informing me of their activities. They also thought to open another space center in Wallops, Virginia, which is an interesting idea. But this time, thankfully, the S2 engine burns for the entirety of its intended duration, and we fire the third stage, spin stabilizing it and blasting our way just about into orbit. The world's first artificial satellite, and it is blasting the national anthem of the USSR at full volume. Forget just sending out little periodic bleeps. We want everyone to know who sent this into space. The Amerikanskis are still fumbling with their launch vehicle. It's still a few months away from being ready, so it looks like we caught them with their pants down. And the response in the US has been nothing short of extremely entertaining. It's quite interesting just how immense an effect Sputnik's launch actually had, with the Red Scare in full effect. You'd think that the actual coverage in the Soviet Union would have been extensive, but it barely actually made front page news in the Soviet Union. It turns out the rest of the world were far more concerned about the world's first artificial satellite being Soviet than the actual Soviets were themselves. But regardless, having attended the launch in person, the new Premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Kerman, congratulates Sergei Kerman on his remarkable propaganda victory and encourages Kaputnik to continue maintaining the Soviet lead in space. Sputnik 2 continues responding for about 3 days before running out of power, and although the ion mass spectrometer returns a hefty chunk of science, the orbit unfortunately wasn't eccentric enough for the micrometeorite detector or the Geiger-Müller counter to return any science. But still, a very successful mission and an immense propaganda victory over the West. So we're just going to close off the episode with a final flight of the Ha-3, with Vladimir at the controls doing yet another supersonic contract. This is actually the beginning of 1955, since we're starting to do away with the 1 year per episode sort of thing, and we thought it best to include the Amerikanskis' first shot at orbit, which actually launches only a month or so after Vladimir's flight, showing that we can't rest on our laurels, they're hot on our heels, and not to be underestimated. But heading into February of 1955, we actually unlock orbital rocketry. Yes, we finally have access to the RD-108, the RD-107 and the RD-211 engines, meaning that we will be constructing a far more capable and reliable orbital launch vehicle in the next episode, as well as most likely a larger launch pad and perhaps even launching the first man across the Kármán line. But that will all be in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you have enjoyed. Be sure to check out N9's video, see what the Amerikanskis have been up to. The video will be linked in the end screen. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.